Wildwood. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Our guest is Adam Cohen, author of the new book, Imbeciles, the Supreme Court, American Eugenics, and the Sterilization of Carrie Buck. Nermeen?
So I wanted to turn to a clip from the 1961 film Judgment at Nuremberg, which references the 1927 case Buck versus Bell. This clip begins with Maximilian Schell playing German defense attorney Hans Rolf. Then we hear from John Wengraf playing Dr. Karl Wieck, former Minister of Justice in Weimar, Germany.
Society can prevent their propagation by medical means in the first place. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. You recognize it now, Dr. Wieck?
No, sir, I don't.
Actually, there is no particular reason you should, since the opinion upholds the sterilization law in the state of Virginia of the United States and was written and delivered by that great American jurist, Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes.
That was a clip from the film Judgment at Nuremberg. So, Adam Cohen, in this film, they actually cite Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes.
And this happened in history as well. This happened at the actual Nuremberg trials. So after World War II, we put the leading Nazis on trial for some of the worst things that the Nazis did. One of those very bad things was they set up a eugenics program where they sterilized as many as 375,000 people. So we put them on trial for that, and lo and behold, as the movie shows, their defense was, how can you put us on trial for that? Your own U.S. Supreme Court said that sterilization was constitutional, was good, and it was your own Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of your most revered figures, who said that. So why are we the bad guys in this story? They had a point.
So can you explain when and why the eugenics movement took hold in the U.S.?
Yeah, so it came over in the early 10s and 20s of 1910s and 1920s. This was actually a very nervous time. You know, you see movies now about the 1920s. You see flappers and prohibition and parties. But America was actually at a time of quiet turmoil. There were the highest rates of immigration that there had been in American history. So the nation's cities were flooded with new immigrants, often with different religions, different nationalities from the people who are already here. Also, people were leaving the farms and moving to the cities. So it was a time of instability, and historians suggest that in this time of instability, the upper classes, the Anglo-Saxons in the United States, wanted to somehow control a changing country, and the way they saw of controlling it was eugenics. We need to firm up our gene pool. So it was that anxiety that got moved into this eugenics movement, and they combined it with the new science of genetics that was emerging, and they came up with these crazy sterilization laws.
So at the time, the establishment of the United States saw the threat as the mass of immigration, the waves of immigration of Jews, of Italians.
Yes, and there were best-selling books, a book by Madison Grant called The Passing of the Great Race, and this was about how whites around the world were in danger. They were being swamped by the so-called colored people everywhere. These were real anxieties adopted at the highest levels, and in The Great Gatsby, there's actually a scene in which Daisy Buchanan's husband, Tom, at a party, begins going off about this book he's read about how the colored people are taking over the world. That actually was representative of the fears of the upper classes of America, and it got channeled into eugenics.
A few years after leaving the White House, President Theodore Roosevelt wrote in a magazine, quote, "I wish very much that the wrong people could be prevented entirely from breeding. Feeble-minded persons should be forbidden to leave offspring behind them."
He did say that, and you know, I was on the Amtrak the other day, and I just happened to be sitting next to a revered American historian, Richard Reeves, and we were talking about this, and he had just finished a book about the Japanese internment, and he said he was shocked to learn that FDR was actually a eugenicist too, and one of the things animating the Japanese internment was that FDR thought that the Japanese were, you know, inferior. So this was widely held by people that we as a country still admire.
Well, in your book, you also talk about the U.S. 1924 Immigration Act and how it was praised by Hitler in Mein Kampf. So could you talk about the act itself and how it was linked to this growing support for eugenics?
Yes, it was largely, in large part, motivated by eugenics. So this villain of the book that I mentioned, Harry Laughlin, he was actually appointed expert eugenics agent to Congress. There's letterhead from the U.S. House Committee on Immigration that says expert eugenics agent. He testified about the eugenic advantages and disadvantages of various nationalities, and he persuaded Congress that Eastern European Jews, Italians, Asians were genetically inferior, and we had to keep them out. That ends up being translated into the 1924 law, which puts in place for the first time national quotas. So you can no longer just show up at Ellis Island. If you're coming from some countries, we don't want you. If you're coming from England and Northern Europe, we do want you. So this ended up completely changing the national composition of immigration, and it was because certain people were deemed to be inferior. And one thing that I thought about when I wrote the book is, when we read the diary of Anne Frank and we realize that she died in a concentration camp, we think about how the Nazis thought the Jews were a lesser race, and that's why they were put in concentration camps. What we don't think about is Anne Frank's father was actually trying to get her and the family to America. He was writing repeatedly to the State Department for visas. He was turned down. He was turned down because of this 1924 act. So when we hear that Anne Frank died in a concentration camp, it's also because the U.S. Congress, like the Nazis, thought that Jews were an inferior race.
Now, interestingly, on the Supreme Court, and one of those who believed in eugenics was the Jewish Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis.
That's absolutely right. And, you know, it's one of the great mysteries is why someone like that would take that view. And Louis Brandeis never talked about it. And, again, it's part of our history that's been airbrushed out. When I started working on this book, I was very excited to get a major biography of Louis Brandeis written by a very respected law professor, 900 pages. And I was looking to see how he explains this. It only mentions Buck versus Bell in a footnote. No one wants to talk about this part of Louis Brandeis's legal career.
Well, Buck versus Bell was decided 8-1. So who was the one dissenting judge?
The one dissenting judge was actually the one Catholic on the court. And interestingly, the one group that really did oppose the eugenics movement was the Catholic Church. They believed both in the idea of reproduction, which we see in the abortion issue, but also they believed that people should be judged on their spiritual qualities, on who they are inside, not by these external qualities that the eugenicists were focusing on. So when there were sterilization law bills that were put up before legislatures around the country, the one group that would consistently show up to oppose them was Catholics, nuns, priests, Catholic lay people. And there were states like Louisiana with large Catholic populations where bills were voted down really because of the opposition of the Catholic Church.
So let's talk about sterilization. What actually happened to, we're talking about up to 70,000 people, mainly women, but a number of men. What were the operations they were put through? Where did this happen?
Yeah, it's kind of barbaric to think about. And actually, in the earliest days of eugenics, it started out with castration. And the eugenicists were having trouble getting legislatures to adopt eugenic sterilization laws because people didn't like the idea of actually castrating people. And it was actually the medical advances, the rise of the vasectomy and the salpingectomy, which is what was done to women, the cauterizing of the fallopian tubes, that made it a little bit more palatable. But these were still terrible operations. And you can imagine what surgery was like in the 1920s. So someone like Carrie Buck was sterilized at the colony for epileptics and feeble-minded by the man, the doctor who was the superintendent of the colony, and it was a terribly invasive operation. She had to recover for 2 weeks. They cut her open, and, you know, all kinds of anesthesia and medical procedures were rather primitive then. So this is what the government was doing. I mean, you think about governmental invasion of your rights. Now we're concerned, as we should be, about the government, you know, reading our emails and listening into our phone calls. They are operating on women and men in this most barbaric way, and I mean, it's really shocking. And as we've seen, the Supreme Court 8-1 said not only that this is fine, but the Supreme Court encouraged the nation to do more. It said, you know, not only is the Virginia law constitutional, not only is it okay to sterilize Carrie Buck, we need more of these operations.
So first it's the vilification of immigrants, and then it's this step.
Yes. You know, the eugenicists were trying to protect the gene pool. So they saw an external threat and an internal threat, and they were addressing them at the same time. Externally, they thought these lesser people are coming into the country. They're going to harm our gene pool. We have to keep them out. And internally, they started looking around the country and asking, who are the people here who have bad genes who we need to eliminate? So they looked at people like Carrie Buck, who was poor, who was undereducated, and they said, that's the kind of people we need to stop internally.
What happened to Carrie Buck afterwards?
Well, you know, her story is so sad. So she did have a baby that was a result of this rape that ended up putting her in the colony for epileptics and feeble-minded. They had promised her throughout the proceeding, and this is in the legal briefs, that one good thing about her being sterilized is she would be returned to her foster family, which was actually raising her baby. So at least she would be able to spend her life raising her daughter, Vivian. But in fact, as soon as they get the court order that she can be sterilized, and she's sterilized, they ask the Dobbs family, her foster family, to take her back. And the Dobbs family said, well, no, actually, we don't want her. So she doesn't get to live with her baby. And then she gets put in a series of household placements where she becomes a housekeeper. She marries a couple of times, but she always wanted babies. And at the end of her life, she said that she really wished she'd had a family, and she didn't. And one other sad part of the story is that people who knew her later in life said she absolutely was not feeble-minded. When she was at a retirement home, she loved getting the newspaper every day, and she used to work on the crossword puzzle. And one other there's so many sad parts of the story, but she had a sister, Doris, who was also at the colony. Doris was sterilized shortly after she was. Years later, when she was an old woman, she wanted to get Social Security, and she wrote to the colony to find out how old she was, because she didn't know. And the colony director came and visited her and told her that she was old enough for Social Security. He also told her that she had been sterilized. She and her husband began crying because they had been trying their whole lives to have children. No one had ever told her that the government had sterilized her. She had been told that she had an appendectomy, and when she went to the doctor, he said, you have this scar, and she said, yeah, it's because they did an appendectomy on me. They'd actually sterilized her, and her whole life, she never knew.
Well, last year, Virginia agreed to compensate victims of state-sponsored forced sterilization. The state agreed to pay each surviving victim $25,000. Lewis Reynolds is among those who received compensation. At the age of 13, Reynolds was incorrectly diagnosed with epilepsy, resulting in his forced sterilization. Reynolds wasn't even aware that the state had conducted the operation until he and his wife encountered trouble starting a family years later. Reynolds spoke to RT about the pain of never being able to have children.
I would love to have a family and children and grandchildren too. And I wonder sometimes, what would I be like a father to my children if I could have any, excuse me, and play with them and everything just like everybody else does.
That was Lewis Reynolds speaking to RT, a victim, one of the many surviving victims of forced sterilization. So could you talk about Virginia's decision to compensate victims, surviving victims? And also, much like Carrie Buck, Lewis Reynolds also wasn't told that he'd been subjected to forced sterilization. So why did the government not tell people that this is what they were doing?
Well, I don't think that they wanted opposition, right? It's much easier to sterilize someone against their will if you don't tell them what's going on. As with Doris Buck, they said, you have a medical problem, you have appendicitis, we have to operate on you. If you say we want to stop you from having children, maybe you get some pushback. So I think it was easier for the doctors involved. And then, they have begun a process of reparations, but it was so slow in coming. On the 75th anniversary of this case in 2002, the governor of Virginia apologized for the sterilizations that occurred, but they didn't begin to compensate people then. They just did that this year. So as a result, I was actually in Virginia yesterday, and someone told me that what they had heard is that only 8 people so far have actually applied for reparations, because so many have died now. If you think about all the people who were sterilized in the 1920s and 1930s, they lived their whole lives and died never being in any way compensated.
What happened with a law upheld by Buck versus Bell?
So it actually remained in place for a long time. There was a lot more sterilization after the Supreme Court ruling. Other states began to adopt such laws. Mississippi passed a eugenic sterilization law in 1928. Virginia kept its on the books until the 1970s, and it was actually sterilizing people through the 1970s.
And Buck versus Bell itself?
Is still the law of the land. In 1942, the Supreme Court got another eugenic sterilization case out of Oklahoma. They had the opportunity to overturn Buck versus Bell. You might think they would have, because at that point, we were at war with the Nazis. The idea of a master race had really been discredited. But the Supreme Court, in striking down the Oklahoma law, did it very narrowly. And the justice who wrote the decision later said they didn't want to overturn Buck versus Bell. And incredibly, in 2001, the U.S. Court of Appeals in Missouri, which is one one step below the U.S. Supreme Court, cited Buck versus Bell in a case involving sterilization of a mildly mentally retarded woman. It is still the law of the land today.
The parallels today?
The parallels are very strong, right? So, first of all, there is some subterranean eugenic sterilization going on right now. We hear about cases in prisons where women are sterilized without their consent. There was a case in Tennessee a couple years ago where a prosecutor was fired allegedly for making eugenic sterilization part of his plea negotiations. And the danger is, as we know, we're in rather strange political times, as we talked about at the beginning of the show. We don't know if there's going to be another eugenics movement. We don't know if states will start to pass these laws. We don't know if Congress might pass these laws. There's a lot of fear in the land. Well, it would be nice to think that the U.S. Supreme Court would defend the victims of these laws, but right now they're on record saying it is constitutional.
We talked about immigrants. What about African Americans through the 20s and the 30s?
Well, it's a strange story. So in the 1920s, the same day that Virginia passed the eugenic sterilization law, they passed their Racial Purity Act the exact same day. The reason they did that was that the eugenicists of that time were so racist that they actually didn't bother with eugenics for blacks. They thought the black race was beyond saving. Their whole focus was uplifting the white race. So they did two things. They built a wall of separation between the white and black races. They imposed large penalties for any kind of sexual unions between blacks and whites. And once they built that wall, they focused on uplifting the white race. So that's why they were focused on white women like Carrie Buck. But then over the years, many blacks were sterilized. And in places like North Carolina in the 70s, it was a lot of poor black people who were sterilized.
So just before we end, explain when and why the U.S. scientific community gave up on eugenics.
Yeah, so at the beginning, they were among the biggest cheerleaders. The medical journals of the 1910s and 20s were enthusiastic about eugenics. Harvard geneticists were in favor of eugenics. Over time, though, it became discredited, I think in part because of the rise of the Nazis. So this Eugenics Record Office, which was a scientific pro-eugenics operation, was funded by the Carnegie Institution. They lost their funding in the late 30s because of the rise of Nazism.
Well, Adam Cohen, it's an astounding book. The book is called Imbeciles, the Supreme Court, American Eugenics, and the Sterilization of Carrie Buck. Adam Cohen is journalist and lawyer, previously member of the New York Times editorial board, former senior writer for Time magazine. He's the co-editor of the National Book Review.com.